Why is Great Britain not so great anymore? There was a time when the sun literally never set on the British Empire. Britain controlled a quarter of the earth. Its navy ruled the oceans, its factories powered the Industrial Revolution, its banks financed global trade, and London was arguably the capital of the world. Fast forward to today, the trains barely work, the economy feels stagnant, young people can't afford houses. And to make matters worse, Brexit divided the country. It seems Britain often feels trapped between nostalgia and uncertainty. So, what happened? How did the world's greatest empire become a country struggling to define its place in the modern world? In this video, we will look at the rise and relative decline of Great Britain. At its peak, Britain was not just a country. It was the global superpower. The British Empire stretched from Canada to India, and Australia to Africa. Britain controlled trade routes, raw materials, strategic ports, huge populations, and global finance. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. Meanwhile, Britain became the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Factories in cities like Manchester and Birmingham produced steel, textiles, ships, and machinery for the entire world. For over a century, Britain had economic dominance, military dominance, technological dominance, and financial dominance. Basically, Britain was the 19th century version of modern America, but with a vast empire. But empires are expensive, and eventually, Britain ran into a problem every superpower faces: it became too big to sustain. Then came World War II, and while Britain technically won the war, financially, it was devastated. The war drained Britain's economy, destroyed infrastructure, and left the country drowning in debt. Meanwhile, two new superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain suddenly found itself the junior partner, overshadowed by the newcomers. And then came the moment many historians consider the true end of British superpower status: the Suez Crisis in 1956. Britain tried to intervene militarily in Egypt after the Suez Canal was nationalized, but the United States basically told Britain, "Stop immediately," and Britain had to obey. It was that moment that shocked the British political establishment, because it revealed something painful. Britain was no longer running the world, it was now dependent on America. The empire soon began collapsing. India gained independence, African colonies followed. And the age of empire was ending. Britain never fully recovered psychologically from that transition. Then came another disaster. Britain's industries started dying. Coal mining declined, steel manufacturing shrank, shipbuilding collapsed, and factories shut down. In the meantime, countries like Germany and Japan rebuilt with newer, more efficient industries after World War II. Much later, the poverty-stricken nation of China eventually became the world's manufacturing giant. Britain struggled to compete, so, by the 1970s and 80s, many industrial regions were collapsing economically, and entire communities built around factories and mines suddenly had no future. Then came Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher transformed Britain's economy. She reduced union power, privatized industries, and shifted Britain toward finance and services. London became enormously wealthy. But many former industrial towns were left behind, and this created the Britain we know today, a country split between a rich, globally connected London and struggling post-industrial regions outside London. It became one of the deepest regional divides in the developed world. Modern Britain still makes money, a lot of money, but increasingly through banking, real estate, finance, and asset speculation, rather than actually producing things like it used to. London became one of the world's top financial centers. But there's a downside. When economies become heavily financialized, house prices explode, inequality grows, wealth begins to concentrate, and productivity weakens. In simple terms, people often don't feel like the economy is improving their lives. Young people especially feel trapped because housing is insanely expensive, rent is brutal, wages haven't kept up, and home ownership feels impossible for many. So, even though Britain remains statistically wealthy, many people don't feel wealthy. Then came Brexit. And Brexit wasn't just about economics, it was about identity. For many Brexit supporters, leaving the European Union represented preserving sovereignty, national independence, and taking back control. For others, it looked like economic self-harm driven by nostalgia. The country became deeply divided, and Brexit exposed rival tensions that had been building for decades: London versus the provinces, young versus old, globalization versus nationalism, and winners versus losers of economic change. Economically speaking, Brexit created new trade frictions and uncertainty where businesses struggled with new barriers, investment slowed, and politics became chaotic. Britain went through multiple prime ministers in rapid succession, which, at one point, the country's economic stability was nearly wrecked by a budget so disastrous, it caused pension funds to panic. Honestly, it takes great skill to scare both economists and retired people at the same time. But, beneath all the economics lies something deeper. Britain still remembers when it was the center of the world, and that memory shapes politics even today. British culture is still heavily tied to World War II victory, imperial history, naval supremacy, and past global leadership. However, the problem is, modern Britain is no longer an empire. It's now a medium-sized country competing in a world dominated by America, China, and massive economic blocs like the European Union. And psychologically, for the British people, that's a difficult pill to swallow. Imagine going from being the CEO of the world to arguing about train delays and potholes around local streets. That gap between historical memory and present reality creates frustration. Some historians call this post-imperial melancholia. In other words, Britain hasn't fully emotionally processed the loss of empire. Now, to be fair, Britain is not a collapsing country. It still has elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge, major scientific research, a powerful military, huge cultural influence, global finance, and strong institutions. The BBC, British music, films, literature, and universities still shape global culture, and Britain remains one of the world's largest economies. So, this is not a story of total collapse, it's a story of relative decline. Britain looks weaker because we compare it to its own extraordinary past, because very few countries in history have ever been as dominant as Britain once was. So why is Great Britain not so great anymore? Because the empire collapsed, industry declined, finance replaced manufacturing, regional inequality deepened, Brexit exposed social fractures, and Britain still struggles with the psychological legacy of being a former superpower. But perhaps the real story is this: Britain isn't becoming weak, it's becoming normal, and for a country that once ruled a quarter of the earth, normal can feel like decline. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more deep dives into history, politics, economics, and the forces shaping the modern world. And let me know in the comments, can Britain reinvent itself, or is the age of British greatness permanently over? Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.